Hello again for those who were in my previous talk, and hello for those who weren't. So, today is supposed to be the methods in the post-method world, and obviously we heard this morning about the variety of methods which perhaps we've learnt about in terms of TPR, lexical approach, etc., grammar translation. There's plenty of others which perhaps weren't mentioned. One of the ones which I encountered first when I was first teaching, I went to live in Spain, and I was in a taxi one day. I told the man I was an English teacher, and he told me, now, the way you need to teach, this is it, this is how you do it, mate. It's basically, you teach them all the consonants, and then you teach them all the vowels, and there you go. Ta-da! There is your English, will be quickly a fluent speaker. Perhaps not the best method. Perhaps you've heard of this one. Learn while you sleep. Best method. I've been trying to practice it with Russian. It's not working very well, I'm afraid. But, I live in hope. So, we might ask, why we have had all these methods in the past. What is it that we're looking for? Is it the march of progress, that grammar translation or direct method was better than grammar translation, audiolingual was better than direct method, communicative approach was better than audiolingual, next approach is better than communicative approach? Who knows? Or is it that we're just looking for some kind of elixir of life? That thing which will turn us from being a beginner student today into a proficient, fluent speaker in 3 months. Searching ever for that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. My feeling is that although some methodologists may have found that pot of gold, I'm not particularly one of them, I don't think, it's an illusion that actually the whining schoolboy with his satchel, shining morning face, is dragging his feet snail-like with misery. And this one was probably going to a communicative language classroom rather than a grammar translation one. It's still the same. We still have students who struggle. We'll still have students who don't have success, whatever the method we use. And perhaps that's what happened. If you look in like most of these kind of grand methods that Dorothy was talking about this morning, kind of basically ended in the 1990s. 1993, Michael Lewis published the lexical approach. Possibly, you could say dogma perhaps has been since then. But it was kind of the last point, I think, of those grand efforts at creating a method and an approach. I kind of think the reason is perhaps for the similar reasons that other disillusionments took hold in the 1990s in general in society and in principles, grand society ideas of organising things. We were disillusioned because basically we found that none of these things worked, that we didn't find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The elixir of life of the fluent speaker has not been found. None of these approaches worked quite as we wanted them to, and so we just basically abandoned them and replaced them with more methods. It's just that they're called coursebooks these days. I actually only kind of really understood this idea when I was going promoting in Spain. Because I was talking to one of the teachers after my talk. I did a workshop, about a kind of lexical approach, and she came up to me and she said, "Oh, me gusta tu método. I love your method." And I thought she was talking about lexical approach and that kind of workshop, but really what she was talking about was my course book. And in effect, of course, she's right. Course books are methods. Every teaching, every class that we do is following a method. The question is, what is that method? And this is what, I suppose, if you asked most coursebook writers and perhaps some teachers, they might say that it's principled eclecticism. I don't know if you have these things in Russia, the pick and mix sweets jar. You go into the shop, you don't have to buy your packet of one type of sweets. You can choose what you like, take a bit from here, take a bit from there, take some others from the other ideas. Kind of what Dorothy suggested at the end of her talk this morning. We could take a bit of audiolingualism. We could take a bit of lexical approach, grammar translation, etc. It's basically choosing, the way that certainly Dorothy was describing, different activities from these approaches. So we do a translation. It's taken from a grammar approach, grammar translation. We do a drill. It's kind of an audiolingual type of thing. These are activities. The question that has come up, though, this is by the applied linguistic Henry Widdowson, in his usual kind of somewhat cynical way, said if you say you're an eclectic but cannot state the principles of your eclecticism, you are not eclectic, you're just confused. It's harsh, but it might be fair. I certainly feel that there are certain aspects of course books, possibly including my own, which are occasionally confused. So, what can we do to avoid this confusion? Obviously here, it's basically trying to decide what are our principles. So what are the principles that we use to choose that activity? Why are we choosing the drilling from audiolingual rather than some other activity from direct method? Here are kind of 3 examples of what I would describe as confusion from my own experience of writing and teaching. When I first started teaching, I did a lot of songs in the classroom, gap-filled songs. I played all kinds of stuff. There's a whole group of Spanish students who hate the song Losing My Religion by REM because I played it about 5 times in the class. Didn't you get that? A lost kind of bull. Is it a bull in the china shop, or what is it that he's saying there? And I did quite a bit of hangman in the class. I was teaching adults mainly, some teenagers. Where's the confusion? What's the principle behind it? The principle, I would say, that I was governing these choices at that time was basically, how much time can I fill up? How long will it last? That was the kind of driving force of my choices in my teaching at the beginning. So you go into the classroom, I'd arrive in my, 9 o'clock in the morning or my evening class at 6. I'd arrive at 5:30. There would be the panic, the usual panic in the staff room. The kind of, oh my God, what am I going to do? Sometimes this would happen in a break. And what am I going to do for the next half an hour? I've run out of this thing. And then somebody would hand over some kind of keep talking activity, coffee potting or something like that. And we would do that for the next half an hour. Now, what I would like to say is that it's not necessarily true that nothing came out of that activity. Maybe the students did learn some new words from the hangman. Maybe they did learn something from the songs I did. Although one of those songs was Old Man River, which contains the classic line, "Tote that bale," which I don't think will be used by any student ever again. But the question is, if you're going to use songs, would you agree that it fills up time is a good principle to choose? My feeling is it's not. Maybe we can use songs. I mean, personally, I pretty much abandoned them in my teaching. But if we're going to use them, the question which we had with Richard about this kind of 7 steps of saying, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? In essence, it's the same with our choices of activities in the classroom. What we need to be asking ourselves is, why are we doing it? So if we're choosing a song, why are we choosing that song? Is this song a better choice than some other song? Why are you choosing that particular song? Is it because it's your favourite? Is that a good reason to choose the song? Similarly, there was a kind of activities of a focus on fun. Fun is a thing which, because I'm a miserable bastard, I don't like fun very much anymore. I don't like the word. I find it involves the idea of what is fun. Is kind of, dancing around the classroom fun? Some people find it so, some people don't. I personally prefer the word enjoyment. Okay? But this is, again, what we want to kind of think about. We're doing a game. We have the principle that we want our classes to be fun or enjoyable. But we need to be asking, well, what constitutes fun? Who for? Are all your students, in line with that concept of fun? And then the last one is something which I mentioned in my session today, and I've come across in my writing over time, is, we're happy to teach things like, in the first lesson, what's your name? Nice to meet you. We don't conceive of this as being at all problematic. In another lesson, we might teach, would you like a coffee? Yes, please, no, thank you. We don't conceive would here as a kind of grammar of would. But, in my experience, when you then suggest, well, I'd like to teach the phrase, have you been to place, that this is suddenly, that's the present perfect. We can't possibly be teaching that in a beginner class, let alone in a unit 6 of a beginner class, or 8, or whatever it is. And my feeling is that unless we understand the principles of what allows us to teach nice to meet you, or would you like, happily, we can't, it doesn't allow us to then to generalize those ideas, to take it beyond other things and incorporate, for example, the chunk, have you been to? It's an example for me of confusion, which exists in lots of course books, as I say, sometimes including mine, because you have to compromise between what perhaps your principles are and what the principles of the publisher are driving it. The other thing before we get into thinking about actual principles and how they might impact on our class is just to think about what is the role of research and science in these things. There are online, you might find communities such as evidence-based learning, who are very strong and very positive at the idea that we can We should refer to scientific research, applied linguistics research, into defining what our principles should be. I would agree up to a point. I think it's good to be thinking and challenging and testing our ideas. When you go to sessions and people tell you, do it works, we need to ask ourselves, what does work mean? What were they working compared to what? How much is it working compared to that other thing? And without kind of interrogating those things, we're just at danger of just accepting anything that we hear. The trouble is that actually within research, I think some of the same problems exist in that the research which happens, it's very often small samples. So, they might do the test on 6 or 7 students, sometimes 20. That sounds big, but it's just not big enough. And so, as a result, whatever results they come up with, whatever results is working, is actually of limited value. We can't apply that necessarily to all situations, all kind of ideas. My other feeling with it is that when you do look at this kind of research, we could give the example of learning vocab in lexical sets, which I recommend you don't do, based on research which finds that when you introduce words in a lexical set, it's marginally more difficult to learn than if you learn them kind of unconnected words or words which are connected within a network of a text. Okay, so this is the research finding you could find. You can look in the book Vocabulary Myths. Keith Folse talks about this. Having said that, the thing we need to pay attention to is that word marginally. That actually, even where there is something we could say is better, and we're trying to prove is better, in the end, the difference is going to be marginal. And this is the reason why we've become frustrated with methods. Because we're hoping this method will change everything. But in fact, if it changes anything, it will be a small thing. So we might then ask, why bother having principles at all? And I'll come on to why in a moment. But first, perhaps think about what principles we might talk about. The reason I think one of the reasons we should think about is thinking of first, what are the principles about language? So this is obviously where I come in as a lexical approach person, if you like. The fundamental thing of a lexical approach is a different view of language. So it's thinking of language as driven by lexis, and the patterns and the grammar that we see comes out of the use of lexis. That is different to one which sees language as a set of rules plus words. There are impacts then about what we do and how we, less on what we do, but more on the language which we use in what we do. I shall come back to that in a moment. And then similarly, there might be principles about teaching and learning. What are our views about how it's best to learn, how it's best to teach? So just very briefly, it's a very quick one here because we're almost around much time. Here are principles about language. If saying yes to these, what might be the impact on what we teach? Just very briefly, just have a little consultation with the person next to you. Okay, I don't expect we don't have much time to talk about it, but basically if we think about language as infinitely flexible and creative, the effect of that is that it doesn't matter whether the language we present to students is something that is used in the real world or not. That is one simple impact. And is one reason that I don't follow that particular view. That actually language is restricted by how our community uses language. Similarly, if we think about teaching and learning, if you think about learning an L2 is exactly like learning your L1. Who agrees with this? Okay, one. Who disagrees? Well, most people, more people. Some just not bothering to put up their hands. Fair enough. But we can imagine, well, what is the impact of that principle? The impact might be that we do a lot more speaking, listening particularly, with the students basically being silent within our classrooms, because that's basically how we did it. Okay? What you teach is what the student learn. Who agrees with that? Okay, so here is a kind of question now. Who disagrees with the idea of giving a model of pronunciation of a Russian speaker? Okay, now I ask you, if what you teach is not what you learn, why should you be worried about Russian speaking, pronunciation, being a model for your students? Because the students will not learn that model from you. Or we could give it another one. If it was a Spanish speaker, put it that way, as a model of pronunciation. The students are not going to start taking up that thing, because basically what we teach them is not exactly what they learn. So this is an example of where we might have a principle which we basically all agree with, but if we take that principle and interrogate our other actions, we might think slightly differently about things that we're doing and our attitudes to other aspects of what we're doing, which I hope will be positive for you. Okay? And this is basically why I think it's important to articulate our principles, because it makes us more secure in what we're doing, and it makes us more able to share what we're doing and explain what we're doing. So, in one sense, we are all methodologists. We're all teaching a slightly different methodology. And what we're doing, I'm a coursebook writer, so I'm writing a brand in that sense for my books. In the same way, if you're a school, my feeling is always that you should be clear when you're employing people, what is your methodology? What are your principles about language and learning? What are your principles that you're employing in the classroom and that you would hope that this new teacher is going to be following as well? Because if you don't, when you then go to observations and you criticize what that teacher is doing, if we're just going for a pure pick and mix, I can take this activity from this process, I can take that activity, then basically the argument is, well, I like that activity. There is no argument, there's no way to kind of communicate and change that behavior if that is your principle, that anything basically goes. It's only when we have the principles in place that we can have the discussion. That doesn't mean to say we all schools have to teach in the same way and all teachers have to teach in the same way. But within a school, if we're doing observations, we need to be working on the same. It's fairer on both the school and the teacher if we're working on the same principles and ways of teaching. Similarly, if you want to develop and you're going to suggest development, how can you do that if you don't agree on the same principles? If it's just a purely pick and mix, then it's just learning some other activities. You could do this, or you could do that, or you could do that. Why? So for me, one of the things that I know that Hugh also talks about as well, is one of the things that helped me develop as a teacher and helped me get to where I am now, is that basically I had friends, colleagues, not just Hugh, but many people I work with at the university, where we developed our own our kind of way of being together. And we supported each other because we understood the basic principles that we were working with. And that allowed us to become better, I think, in the way we wanted to teach. So if you want to teach in a grammar plus words way, that's fine. I think the difference is marginal. Obviously, I think my method is better because that's why I'm doing it. But I understand that the difference is marginal. So if you want to go on that way, it's being clear those are your principles and how we can apply those in our day-to-day activities. Similarly, if you want to be a task-based learner better, we need to find similar people who share those principles and help us with it. And then the last thing is perhaps it helps us to defend ourselves from dogma. Now, I give the example of CELTA here. I know CELTA is a good course in lots of ways, and I learnt a lot from it myself. But in my subsequent teacher training, I sometimes get teachers coming up to me and saying, so it's okay to translate, or so I can talk to my students, I can use teaching talk. I thought we should say as little as possible. And it seems to me that sometimes with some CELTA centres, they are not clear enough about what are their principles underlying their practice. And especially if you are a practicing teacher yourself and have already established some of your own principles, when you then come and clash, it's important to be able to articulate and ask them what is driving their principles and these activities in order to be able to have an honest and open discussion. And also perhaps in order to choose a good centre which matches closer to your approach. Last thing, as you will see, I'm not, I'd love if people taught more with a lexical approach and came to do our courses and joined us. But for me, the most important thing is feeling comfortable within your own framework, your own methodology. And it's finding those fundamental principles which is part of that. If you are comfortable and at peace with yourself as a teacher, I think you do convey that to your students, and that in a way is part of what a successful classroom will be. That the students will trust you more and you will form part of a better working relationship. Very last thing, I always do this, always forget there's one last thing, is basically, even then, when I come to do teaching, for example, or when I'm coming to do writing, sometimes compromises come up. Or sometimes I have a bad day and I'm just not kind of with it. There is this concept of the good enough parent, that psychologically, perfectionism is a bad thing for children. And it's a bad thing for the parents themselves. And that actually what we need to be doing is good enough. And that kind of provides a kind of more psychologically sensible kind of feeling in the classroom. So from that point of view, establish your principles, think about how they reflect in your activities and the choices you make, but don't be too hard on yourself if you don't always live up to them. Thank you very much.